Boldwood presents The Winter Killings, written by Wes Markin and read by Aubrey Parsons. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. The vastness, alive with snowfall. Such sights. She peels off her gloves. She reaches out. Cold stabs her fingertips. Heavy ice crystals growing heavier, spiraling. White settles on dark. Dead stars above, light freed, it reaches her eyes. Into her, around me. She now belongs. His noise does not compare to this freedom. His pleas mean nothing. The snow blankets him. The dead of winter. Snow, stars, bitter winds. His corpse alive with hunger and need. Watch them eat. She observes, sees the scavengers' cold stabbing teeth. Vultures pick. Rats gnaw. She draws closer, wants to share. Scavengers depart. The appetites of nature do not care for her. They are blameless. Never has she felt like this, spiraled like this, shone like this. Spring's renewal. Warm red stone. Feeding insects. Awakening birds. His remains, alive with invisibility, see the bacteria dissolve him. She kneels, she surveys. Microorganisms are not for her eyes. The insignificance of human wanting, not nature's concern. Who can blame it? Happy in the vastness, quarry stone beneath her feet. Forestry offering isolation. Cold water down her throat, a shirt stuck to damp skin. Energy and movement everywhere. For her, for nature. Except for him. His energy is back with the world, his return to nothing at an end. The height of summer. An overturned cart. Bones. Chains. The fields and trees alive with colour observe the world reborn. She touches, she considers a white shape of nothing on red rocks. Dust on dust, shortening days, softening lights. Energy inside her. I am reborn. Evil stripped bare. Autumn's harvest. Separation. A skull with no body. A body with no skull. The fruits of my labour. Chapter 1. While finishing her pint, DCI Emma Gardner regarded the tapestry on the wall in front of her. Carefully woven woolen and silken threads depicted Knaresborough Castle. Knights, readied for battle, occupied the scene's foreground. When her empty pint glass was back down on the solid wood table, she panned her gaze to the bar, where her colleague was ordering their next round, and smiled. There was nothing Gardner enjoyed more than a midweek pint or two in an oldie-worldy pub. Having been born and raised in the southern medieval city of Salisbury, rustic drinking holes were part of her tapestry. And Blind Jack's, with its beamed ceilings and flagstone floors, reminded her so dearly of home. The only element that disappointed up here in Yorkshire was the ale. There weren't many ales in the world that stood a chance against summer lightning. A golden ale produced locally by Hopback Brewery in Wiltshire. Since being seconded to North Yorkshire 18 months ago, Gardner had contended with many new flavours before gravitating towards the local delicacy of Yankee, a pale ale brewed by Brewster's Brewing Company. Despite not even coming close to Summer Lightning, she wondered if, in time, she could grow to love it, in the same way she'd come to love Yorkshire itself. Her thoughts on Salisbury gave her a momentary feeling of homesickness, and she realised then that maybe the choice of ale and decor wasn't the main reason for sudden nostalgia. Maybe it was the freedom she'd enjoyed back then, to hit the local taverns after a day's graft and dissolve everything into a blur, or shoot ideas back and forth over a current case. Such freedom these days was proving to be way out of her budget. Recently divorced, Gardner was bringing up 2 young girls, her 8-year-old daughter, Anna, and her 9-year-old niece, Rose. Although reasonably well paid as a DCI, her often erratic hours, combined with a lack of any family in the area, made it necessary to employ Monika Kowalska, an au pair from Poland. Add to that, her grace period of accommodation provided for her with her secondment had expired, and rent was through the roof. Yes, things were bleak, and getting bleaker. So, 5+ pints of beer several nights a week in a pub was an indulgent freedom that was out of the question. For now, she thought with a grin, let's stick with once a week and see how we go. She looked through the window at the monolithic, glamorous tree in the market square and felt the bubbles of anxiety. The costs associated with entertaining 2 young children at Christmas were not to be sniffed at. Really, I shouldn't be here at all. And I wouldn't be if not for... Lucy O'Brien put the pint glass down in front of Gardner. Wonder if this one slips down as quickly as the last one? Gardner smiled. I'm happy to try it. Because there's nothing I enjoy more, Gardner thought, staring into O'Brien's eyes, than your company right now. O'Brien held her gaze and returned the smile, causing Gardner to feel her usual spike of guilt and look away. O'Brien was late 20s, and so considerably younger than her. She was also a detective constable, which made Gardner her superior. 2 red flags. 2 red flags that were ignored when O'Brien had asked her out for a drink 3 weeks back, and had continued to be ignored every week since. Gardner wasn't gay, had never considered herself gay, and still couldn't really believe that this possibility was on the table. But O'Brien's company was having a profound effect on her. It was undeniable, intoxicating. And as for O'Brien, well, she was openly gay. She'd also dropped many hints that she'd had a crush on Gardner that she was convinced she wasn't misreading. Whereas flirtatious smiles, brief touches on the arm, and long social conversations in her office could be passed off as an extremely close friendship, some of O'Brien's most recent moves had just been too telling. She'd been there for Gardner at every turn, every rough turn, above and beyond. Whether that be to provide her with a cereal bar for breakfast in an incident room when Gardner's nights had got late and fraught, or after the breakdown of her marriage, providing herself as a shoulder to cry on, and more recently, and far more significantly, taking her children to stay with her sister when Gardner worried that there may be some kind of threat at their own home. Gardner took a large mouthful of her drink. 3 weeks into this social arrangement, she realised Yankee was, in fact, tasting better. I could get used to this. The beer? Yes, She broke off after catching O'Brien's raised eyebrow. What are you implying? But the company stands up too. Glad to hear it. Christmas was always impossible to ignore, whether it was the lit-up tree that dominated the market square, or the tinsel that adorned the old bar. It always found its way to you. Conversation invariably turned in that direction, and when O'Brien said she was spending it alone, Gardner spoke without thinking. "Monica's going home to Poland. Come and have Christmas dinner with me and the girls." Wow. Had she really just said that? She picked up a pint and drank. Several mouthfuls in, she glanced at O'Brien, who was beaming. "What am I doing?" "It really is slipping down faster than the last one, isn't it?" O'Brien said and chuckled. Gardner put the glass down and looked at it. "Been a long week. What am I saying? It's always a bloody long—" She felt O'Brien's fingers on her arm. Another innocuous touch? But if so, why am I tingling all over? "The girls would love it if you came. So would I." Shit, Gardner thought, tempted to finish her pint, but holding back, knowing how ridiculous it had looked to throw it back in so short a time. She smiled at O'Brien. Intoxication. What the hell am I doing? Chapter 2. Henry Akroyd had only been here for 3 days. He wasn't yet used to the stench of piss, which had made him throw up more than once, or the rising damp, which seemed to reach out and clutch at him like a cold, clammy hand. Still, Jay had given him some hope. "If you trust Tommy, if you do as he says, he'll look after you. You'll get used to it all, and you'll enjoy the rewards." If anyone would know, then Jay would. He'd been here for a while. At least he acted as if he'd been here a while. Working for Tommy Rose, taking the phone calls, welcoming in the junkies, serving up the product. The job fitted him like a glove. So, despite his concerns, Henry had remained positive. He'd his brother Archie's advice to thank for that. "I give them all the same advice first day," Archie had said when he'd reached the lofty heights of store manager in a local McDonald's. "You want to keep your job? Best to smile when you serve those burgers. Positivity always wins the race." Of course, Henry had known that this was all sanctimonious bullshit. His brother would never have the balls to say such things in the modern world, but the sentiment of what he'd said rang true, and it rang true in a cold house that stank of piss. Positivity always wins the race. And when Henry collected his first payment, it'd be more than Archie could ever imagine earning. Talk about irony. Henry paced the lounge, burner phone in hand, taking calls. The pacing helped to keep him warm. He was too cold to sit still on the battered sofa. He regarded the television leaning against the yellowing wall and the attached PlayStation, and realized he'd never seen them in operation. This job didn't throw up much free time. They worked through the night, serving addicts and rich yuppies. Sleep when you're dead, not when you can make money. Besides, 5 a.m. to midday was quiet. Plenty of time to snooze. He caught a break between phone calls and stood over at the dusty mantelpiece, observing his face in a cloudy mirror. He wasn't yet out of his 20s, and his hair was already thinning. His brother was 5 years older and hadn't yet lost a strand. "Archie the arsehole," he said, and noticed in the bottom right corner of the mirror that someone had written their name in the dirt. Dan, my predecessor. On the first evening, Henry had asked Jay what had happened to his predecessor. "Just do as Tommy says. Take what he gives you, nothing more. If you do that, you'll be fine." Henry wondered if Dan had ignored Jay's advice. He also wondered, with a shiver running down his spine, whether writing his name in the dirt with his finger was Dan's last act on this earth. He shrugged, turned and continued to pace. Dan had obviously not done what he'd been told. He'd nothing to worry about. He'd been following Tommy's rules to the letter, Not that there were many. In fact, there'd only really been one. Just do what you've been doing small time, lad. Sell. Except now, do it big time. Henry had been happy to oblige. And, stinking as it may be, he had a roof over his head and the promise of a first pay packet in 4 days. That it was illegal and immoral didn't bother him. His rules for living were simple. If someone else is prepared to do it, then don't be a dickhead and opt out. He'd once had a girlfriend who'd buzzed with morality. He'd watched her turn down well-paid jobs if they weren't ethical enough. That was a lot of jobs. Cutting your nose off to spite your face, he'd told her. Get out of my life, she'd eventually said. Sodder, he thought. Enjoy being a librarian for the rest of your life. And it now seemed like he'd made the right move. I stand to win big, if I can keep my dinner down and the hypothermia at bay. Hey! It was Jay, standing at the lounge door. Jay came across as a man who'd been in this game a while, which, according to Henry's calculations, should make him a big winner. Not that he looked or sounded like one. With a long, lank mop and uncontrolled facial hair, he cut a dishevelled figure. In 3 days, Henry had yet to see him change his clothes. It was genius, really. If anyone from the law came to the door, would they suspect this man of being a flush dealer? They certainly wouldn't want to get close enough to find out. He stank. Another thing he'd noticed about Jay was that he drank like a fish. And not just beer either, but spirits. Morning, noon and night, he'd seen him glugging from vodka bottles at regular intervals. Henry was no stranger to alcoholics. His father had been one. Men like that couldn't function without high levels of alcohol in their bloodstream. And, with it in their bloodstream, they could give some appearance of normality. Before you keeled over, clutching your rotten stomach, of course, which his own father had eventually done. He wondered if Tommy knew about Jay's drinking. And if he didn't, would he care that one of his most prolific dealers was a high-functioning alcoholic? As Jay came into the lounge, swigging from a Coke bottle, clearly laced with vodka, Henry wondered if this was an angle he could exploit. Would Tommy appreciate the truth? Would Tommy promote him to the key man and replace Jay with a new apprentice? Maybe that's what had happened regarding Dan. Out with the old, in with the new. We're off the clock for 1 hour, Jay said. Switch off, completely. Henry killed his burner. Why? Jay sat on the battered sofa and sighed. Tommy's on his way. Really? Jay rubbed his temples. He wants us to do something. Tommy's visit seemed rather sudden. Shit, have I cocked up? Well, what does he want us to do? Henry asked. Jay didn't look up. Not sure, but just do as he says, like always, and everything will be fine. Bit out of the blue, though, eh? What does he want? Jay looked up at him. His eyes looked tired and worn. Henry noted the sadness in them, deep, fixed like a scar. For you to do your job, what he expects. You're at his beck and call. It sounded ominous. He watched Jay drink from his bottle while telling himself, if someone else is prepared to do it, then don't be a dickhead and opt out. Sounds exciting. Jay looked at him. He didn't answer but simply shook his head and then lowered it again. Maybe exciting was the wrong choice of word. Terrifying might be more appropriate. Henry took a deep breath. No way was he backing out now. I'm not cutting me nose off to spite my face. Chapter 3. 3 points of Yankee to the good. Gardner felt her worries and inhibitions dissolve. Her thoughts regarding O'Brien were comforting rather than concerning. She enjoyed looking into O'Brien's eyes and felt that she could tell her anything, which she did. A traumatized childhood, A family at the mercy of Jack Moss, her younger brother. "He's missing something," Gardner pointed at her forehead. "Something here. Something important." O'Brien nodded. She wasn't about to disagree. O'Brien had encountered Jack before while looking after his daughter, Rose, and had copped a blow to the head for her troubles. "The best place for him right now is where he is," Gardner said. "In jail." So engrossed in her own tale of woe, and those steady eyes that seemed to draw every morsel from her, she'd only now noticed that O'Brien was touching the back of her hand. The front door of the pub burst open. Two middle-aged men, complete with Santa hats and lopsided Christmas jumpers, stumbled in. Gardner drew her hand back. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," O'Brien said. "You can tell me anything." Gardner stared into her eyes again. "I know that. I really do." The door opened a second time in as many minutes. This time a portly pirate strolled in, complete with eye patch. If it wasn't for the large wheeled suitcase he dragged, Gardner would have feared that she'd just slipped through a crack in time. A woman, who was taller and thankfully dressed in more modern attire to bring Gardner back to reality, followed him in with another suitcase. They both went to the bar. She flashed a look at O'Brien, who laughed. "Your face," O'Brien said. "Have you not seen the pirate? It's Robert Thwaites. He's local. Is it not a bit late for a children's party?" O'Brien laughed again. "He's a storyteller. Very animated one, too." She waved her arms. "All grand gestures." She patted her chest. "And booming voices. Those suitcases are full of props." She nodded at the couple at the foot of the stairs. "That's his glamorous wife, Cassandra. Used to be the Avon lady around these parts." "An Avon lady? Bloody hell. I'm surprised you even know what an Avon lady is." "I'm not bloody Gen Z. The Avon ladies were still going door to door when I was a kid. These are the wilds of Yorkshire, remember? Took us a lot longer than you southerners to climb out of the dark ages and migrate to the joys of online purchasing." O'Brien patted Gardner's arm and raised an eyebrow towards the stairs. "Want to watch? A retelling of Treasure Island? One of my favourite books growing up." "Yes, even so. An adult pantomime or real ale and grown-up conversation?" "Shouldn't knock it until you try it. Notice how busy it's getting?" Gardner listened. The noise of conversations from the back room and the clinking of glasses was louder. Telling her own story, a very different story from Treasure Island, although potentially filled with as much drama, had distracted her from witnessing how quickly Blind Jack's could fill up. This Thwaites must be quite the draw. O'Brien laughed. "Maybe. More likely you're in Yorkshire, and here people are a sucker for free entertainment." Gardner was about to point out that there was nothing free about entertainment, when the ale might as well be acid poured onto your disposable income, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. "I'm sorry," Gardner said, reaching for her phone. "Might be about the kids." "No need to apologise. When I was your age, hardly anyone looked at their phones while in conversation." "You sound like my mother." "That's probably because I'm old enough to be here." This thought concerned her momentarily, but after reading the text message, it became the furthest thing from her mind. She rose to her feet. "You okay?" O'Brien asked. "No." Gardner's heart thrashed in her chest. "I've got to make a call. I'm sorry." As Gardner headed for the exit, she reread the message again. "I think I've found him. Phone me." Chapter 4. "If someone else is prepared to do it, then don't be a dickhead and opt out." These words were now replaying on an endless loop in Henry's mind. But for the first time in his life, they weren't helping. Tommy Rose's instructions had knocked him sideways. "Maybe someone else could do it, someone who understands it better than me," Henry pleaded. Deaf ears. Tommy was a beast of a man with a flattened nose and dead eyes. He didn't do conversations, and he certainly didn't answer questions. Tommy simply repeated his instruction. "I want you to do this." Beside him, Jay, who'd faced the same instruction, looked nonchalant. These instructions hadn't surprised him. Either all the piss he'd been drinking had numbed him, or he was simply used to performing such favours. "No, I can't," Henry stood. "There's a line." Tommy moved aside and nodded at the door to show that it was just fine to use it and leave. Shit. Did that mean he would be leaving empty-handed? "I've been here 3 days." Tommy nodded. "I've sold a lot." Henry felt overwhelmed, disappointed. There'd been so much hope in his current employment. "A shame. You showed promise." Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out a large bundle of notes. Henry's heart fluttered. That was probably more money than his sanctimonious brother would earn in a year. That could set him up good and proper. Tommy slid off the elastic and peeled off some notes. He leaned over the coffee table and dropped a couple of £50 notes in front of him. They nestled between 2 loaded syringes. "Is that it? 3 days?" Dangerous to speak your mind when Tommy Rose was involved, but Henry couldn't keep it in. "That's not even minimum wage." "That's your earnings minus my costs for finding you, for housing you, for training you." "You found me in a nightclub dealing pills. You housed me in a rotten shithole. And what bloody training?" He didn't speak his thoughts this time. They'd be too inflammatory. Inwardly sighing, he glanced down and let his hand hover over the money and the needles. Sterile needles. Both Tommy and Jay had assured him of this. "If someone else is prepared to do it, then don't be a dickhead and opt out." His hand initially descended towards the money, before changing trajectory towards one syringe. You can't get addicted just doing it the once, can you? He flicked his eyes over to Jay. His drawn, emaciated face and hollow eyes acted as a warning. "But it won't be just the once, will it? Tommy will ask you to test it again and again. Do you want to be a human guinea pig, Henry? The last line of defence between the production line and the disappointed punters?" No, this wasn't for him. He opted for the money, brushed past Jay's legs, and circled the left side of the coffee table, and did a full loop of the lounge in order to give Tommy a wide berth. As he neared the door, he glanced at the paltry sum of cash in his hand, and the disappointment he felt was crushing. Only earlier he'd believed that he'd 1 foot back up on the ladder of life, that he'd soon be looking down at his brother on a lower rung. He glanced back at Jay, who'd already tied his upper arm and was prepping a vein with 2 fingers. If someone else is prepared to do it? No. He forced himself onwards, but inches from the door he saw that smiling ex-girlfriend, the librarian for life. "Now who's cutting their nose off?" He lowered his head, shook it, and sighed. Then he turned back in time to see Jay close his eyes and slump back on the sofa, the used needle hanging from his arm. Henry recalled the bundle of notes that had just come out of Tommy's pocket, the bundle which had almost stopped his heart. There was promise and hope in this room, and money. He turned and headed back to the sofa, determined to keep climbing this ladder. "Okay," he said, "just this once." As he returned to the sofa, he expected to catch a grin on Tommy's face, a smug reaction to his employee's lack of willpower. But there was nothing. Just a stony expression, and then a swift nod, when Henry picked up the needle and sat back down. Chapter 5. "I think I've found him. Phone me." "What if I could get through?" Gardner thought, yanking up the hood on her ski jacket to cut off the sudden snowfall before hitting redial. Voicemail again. Shit! Relentlessly, she continued to circle the Christmas tree in the market square, her face burning with cold, pounding her phone. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. A teenage couple with matching Christmas bobble hats, who were only moments ago lost in each other's eyes, looked up at her from a bench with concerned expressions. Piss off! I know you think I'm a casualty of mulled wine, but that really isn't it. She turned and paced back the other way, wiping snow from the phone screen with her sleeve. Okay, one last try, I promise. Come on, Cecile, pick up, pick... Emma, I'm sorry. Cecile Metcalfe's voice crackled. Her last words were cut off. Cecile? The line was dead. Gardner looked up at the stars. Could you give me a break? Snow stung her eyes. Breaking her promise, she tried again. Her frustration was intensifying. Her erratic stomping had scared the young lovers away. So she sat down on the bench beside a statue of old Mother Shipton and stared at her phone screen. She opened her mouth to swear, but then her screen lit up with a message. Cecile, I'm sitting on a house in the arsehole of nowhere. Reception is crap. Hope this finds a way through. I didn't want to give you half a story. Having exceeded its characters, the message had broken. The other element was awaiting reception and a tower to bounce off. Give me strength. Cecile Metcalfe was a former detective inspector who'd been one of Gardner's mentors during the earlier stages of her career in Wiltshire. After a heart attack in her 40s, she decided life was just too short for what she called the excessive male-dominated bureaucracy and had taken early retirement. This was over 10 years ago. Since then, Cecile had built a successful business offering investigation services for finding people. It was popular with estranged siblings who'd lost one another, or families torn apart by overseas conflict. Her results spoke for themselves. She was highly skilled. And to Gardner, her services were free. They'd remained close friends and in constant contact since Cecile had retired, and when she'd heard Gardner's tale of woe of a lost colleague, she'd offered her help. At first, Gardner had refused because she'd wanted to keep it off the books, but Cecile had offered to keep it discreet and take the case herself rather than use any of her many staff. Gardner had still refused because Cecile was getting too old for long trips and surveillance. But Gardner was also desperate, and, eventually, Cecile's insistence broke through what was, ultimately, a very fragile resistance. Her phone beeped. The message was complete. She read on. And get your hopes up. I'm sending an image of the man I found. He's in this house. I'll give it one more hour, then I'll drive home and phone you. See. She double-checked her messages, but knew already that no photo had come through, or was likely to. Not until Cecile got some better reception. 1 hour. How the hell do I stay calm for 1 more hour? Well, she could start with the alcoholic beverages behind the bar in Blind Jack's, and if she suddenly had to go anywhere, she could get a taxi. Inside, O'Brien smiled up at her while simultaneously pointing at a fresh pint that awaited her. Gardner smiled back, and their eyes locked. But now the eye contact quickly became awkward. She averted her eyes, wondering if she was just being emotional because of Cecile's discoveries. But that wasn't the entire story, was it? A wave of sadness washed over her, because she knew, at this very moment, that she could no longer allow this to develop into something inappropriate and unprofessional. No more playing, Emma. She wants more, and you can't give it to her. It had to end tonight. Everything okay? You looked stressed out before. Yes. Rose has had a temperature, Gardner lied. Monica just thought it best to clear the Calpol with me first. I see. Then she sat down and drank deeply, trying to shift away the emotions clouding her. But it was probably useless. Other than her children, there were two more people she cared for deeply in this world. A young woman with warm eyes and a beautiful heart that she'd have to break, and an impetuous ex-alcoholic who'd vanished without a trace. The only way out of this was a complete distraction. Actually, I think I'd like to check out the storyteller. Chapter 6. Before the needle, he'd felt cold. Not just from the lack of warmth in the room, but also from the events playing out in front of him. Watching the new boy, Henry Akroy, flounder at Tommy's request was a hard watch. Henry was only in his 20s. He'd every right to flounder, listen to his gut, and run. However, after the needle, a warm flush washed away the cold, and the sinking began. Henry and Tommy's standoff dissolved into atoms. He made a deep descent away from the brightness, away from a frantic place of worry, doubt, and crushing pain, into a slower place, a shallow, smooth, and silent void in which he could float. Time had lost relevance. Moments he loved had no longer ended. And yet, even in this void, it felt tangible. His daughters, Molly and Lucy, his wife, Rachel, his mentor, Anders, his young friend, Arthur. Tangible. Maybe it wasn't a void after all. Maybe D.I. Paul Riddick had returned to a world he no longer had. And right at this moment, he didn't have to worry about staying or going, because it simply was. Chapter 7. To his credit, the storyteller's skills extended beyond fancy dress. However, Gardner's mind was too plagued for focus, and Robert Thwaites, despite his athletic prancing, repertoire of facial expressions and booming voice threatening to make the wooden beams in the ceiling drop, failed to entertain her. Robert had commandeered the corner of the upstairs back room. It limited his show to a small treasure chest perched on a table that he circled as he told his tale, pausing every now and again to jab and sweep at the air with a fake cutlass. There were 2 filled tables, and the remaining spectators stood. 15 patrons, including Robert's wife, ex-Avon lady Cassandra, who stood directly to the left of Gardner and O'Brien. And what a time she was having. She stared doe-eyed at her husband as he performed, her mouth moving in sync with the words he used. She looked like a teenage girl at a boy band concert. "Around me, around the cove," Robert stage whispered, moving closer to his small crowd. "Lay the bones of the greedy. Stark warnings to the likes of—" He narrowed his unpatched eye and moved it closer to a middle-aged man as if to examine him. "The foolhardy." The audience laughed. So did the middle-aged man, although the sudden glow in his cheeks betrayed his embarrassment. What a bloody pantomime. Gardner looked at O'Brien, who was laughing. Surely she was faking amusement. When she turned her attention back to the eccentric thespian, she felt O'Brien's fingers stroking her own. And then the dam that had kept her concerns and doubts penned back for the last couple of months finally collapsed. She closed her hand into a fist and pulled it away. She then looked at her colleague apologetically. "We can't do this." O'Brien's face dropped. Gardner opened her mouth to apologize, only for the storyteller to pick up volume.
Remember, patrons, this is an isle forsaken by men and maps. Many suspected, but never really knew, if Valentia's curse was indeed a great bounty, or a trap ready to claim their lives. Do you not recall, mates, the warnings that it was her enduring love and passion for someone she could never have that led to her downfall? How could anyone trust such a great treasure?
Gardner was glad she'd been interrupted by the thespian. Her apology would surely have been pathetic. She took a deep breath to stem the inner turmoil she was feeling, while the tale of this old sea dog's adventures continued in a swashbuckling, grandiose fashion. And, although the surrounding punters were lapping it up, expressing themselves with guffaws and the occasional cheer, Gardner became more and more tempted to remove herself from the pub. But when she glanced at the sadness in O'Brien's face again, she decided that leaving now would only intensify her disappointment and the embarrassment. So she drank from her pint glass, hoping that more alcohol would steady her need to flee.
And it was this dream that told me that the treasure, the vast treasure, had been tucked within a chapel ruin.
He swigged ale from another of his props, a tarnished metal tankard. He purposefully let the ale run down over his chin and down his front. Cue more raucous guffaws.
And naught but silence and spiders guarded it.
While Robert mimicked the creak of the chapel doors, the skitter of the spiders, and the sound of his own steps, Gardner leaned over to O'Brien's ear and whispered, "Let's go down. We need to talk."
"I want to watch the show,"
O'Brien whispered. She didn't turn to look at Gardner.
"I've heard her." "Okay, after? I thought you might have somewhere to be."
O'Brien didn't bother whispering this time. There was a woman's voice behind Gardner.
"Shh, I'm trying to listen."
"Sorry," Gardner whispered over her shoulder, without looking back to see the offended party.
"My hands," the storyteller continued, holding them up to his audience, "my hands, gnarled as the ancient driftwood that lines the shores of this isle."
He turned from the audience and went around the side of the table and to another prop, a wooden treasure chest.
"My hands hovered above the bounty, the curse."
He raised an eyebrow and turned to smirk at the small crowd.
"The mystery."
There were murmurs of excitement from several of the listeners. Gardner was desperate to move to O'Brien's ear again and whisper more apologies, but not only would she incur more wrath from O'Brien, but she now had a frustrated patron just behind her too. Gardner felt her stomach cramp. She dealt with the discomfort with 2 mouthfuls of ale. Robert still had his hands over his fake treasure chest and was letting them quiver dramatically, as if it was a source of supernatural energy. Gardner suddenly felt irritated by him. She closed her eyes and took another deep breath. Give him a break, Emma. Yes, this wasn't her bag, but her irritation was because of her own conduct this evening, and not this well-meaning showman. She opened her eyes and cast another glance at O'Brien, who still looked annoyed, and then over to Cassandra. Her hand was to her mouth, as if the tension over what was in the chest was tearing her in two. Ridiculous, really, from someone who must have seen this performance 1,000 times. Again, harsh, Emma. This was a family business. Cassandra probably considered it a job to help with the atmosphere. If she was kicking back at the bar, drinking the profits and rolling her eyes, wouldn't that be more ridiculous? Finally, Robert moved his bloody hands down to the treasure chest and traced the cheap stainless steel latches. He suddenly looked up, wide-eyed.
"Hear that thunder? Believe me all, the curse is real. A storm has arrived that could sink 1,000 ships."
He held a finger in the air.
"Never again would I underestimate the power of unrequited love, and neither should you."
He lowered his finger, took a loud, deep breath, and closed his eyes.
"And then I doubted whether I could go on. Something was not as it should be. My memories of that story, of Captain Raphael Duarte's head being torn from his shoulders. All semblance of God was gone from Valentia's world. What was I doing here, at the bounty of evil?
He flicked back one of two latches.
And yet I couldn't stop myself. The mystery was too great.
What had the wretched pirate queen placed in here before her final breath? His hand hovered over the second latch. He looked at the audience.
You!
He pointed at the man he'd embarrassed earlier.
Would you have opened it?
No, the man said, laughing nervously and looking at his partner.
Not even for riches and rewards? I think the chance of the abyss may be a risk worth taking. I opened it. Do you wish to know what I found?
Yes, the man said meekly, looking awkward. Gardner saw his partner nudge him. I do, yes, I do, the man said loudly, forced to enter into the spirit of the thing before shaming him and his wife. Gardner's phone buzzed in her pocket.
Now we must all be silent,
Robert boomed. Gardner took her phone from her pocket. The image from Cecile had arrived.
So I flicked the second latch,
he gasped,
all the while contemplating what awaited me. Jewels, gold, coins.
Gardner had to force back a gasp of her own as she stared at the photograph of a dishevelled, emaciated man sitting on a garden wall of a decrepit terraced house, swigging from a Coke bottle. His hair was long, and he was unshaven. But it was unmistakably him.
Or would this lost soul, consumed by her own darkness, have left a void?
A thumping sound made Gardner flinch, and she looked up. Robert bashed his own chest.
My heart was thrashing.
Exactly how I feel. It was him. Riddick. Her mind whirred. She didn't know what she felt. Relief that she'd found him? Despair over the fact that he looked more broken than ever? Robert threw back the lid of the chest. Riddick was alive. He was alive! Alive!
It was the head!
Robert shouted, reaching into the chest.
The missing head! Captain Raphael Duarte's head!
There were murmurs of astonishment from the crowd. Gardner leaned over to O'Brien, who looked as far removed from the tension and drama in the performance as anyone could be. I've got to go. Sorry. Something incredibly urgent.
Shit! Christ!
Robert hissed.
Shit!
Gardner turned in time to see Robert pulling a skull from the chest before recoiling, releasing the grip on his prop. It fell back into the chest with a clatter. There were more gasps and guffaws from the crowd over Robert's revelation. However, the image of her wasted former colleague hunched over on a garden wall completely distracted Gardner. She desperately needed to get out of here. I'm sorry, Lucy. She turned to leave. Robert's voice was growing in volume, as were the number of obscenities used.
What the hell? What the hell is that doing in there?
Realizing Robert had clearly slipped out of character, Gardner swung back in time to see him throw himself back against the wall, staring wide-eyed at the treasure chest. Gardner felt her instincts kicking in. Something's very wrong here. But the crowd didn't think so. They were enjoying his performance of shock and horror, clapping and guffawing. The drama hadn't been this good before, nowhere near. To go up so many notches in quality could mean only one thing. She confirmed it by looking over at Cassandra. Gone were the doe eyes in the fangirl response. She, too, was stunned.
That's a real sodding skull!
Robert shouted. Confirmation. Gardner marched over to the treasure chest and stared down. Indeed, the skull was no cheap prop. She turned and watched Robert edging around the wall past the window which showed the market square Christmas tree in all its glory to Cassandra's side.
That's still mine! I didn't put that in there!
He shouted over to Gardner. The noise from the crowd quietened. The penny was dropping. She turned and saw one old couple still clapping at the table. Robert Thwaites looked like he was going to keel over from a heart attack, for pity's sake. And Gardner herself had just broken the fourth wall. Gardner, who still had her phone in her hand, exchanged it for her badge in her pocket. She held it up. "DCI Emma Gardner." Silence descended, but people still glanced at one another, perhaps confused over whether this was part of the show. It'd be a very random show, Gardner thought. "I'd like everybody to go downstairs, please, quietly and slowly. Nobody is to leave." "He's not mine," Robert said, plucking off his eye patch. Gardner looked at O'Brien. "Detective Constable, can you stay with the remains while I make the calls?" "Remains?" Cassandra gasped. O'Brien nodded. "Yes, boss." Chapter 8. Henry Akroy made a horrendous groaning noise. It pulled Riddick from his semi-conscious state, and he turned his head. Beside him, Henry thrashed about. Riddick tried to reach out, but his arm was slow to respond. By the time he was close enough, Henry's convulsions had pitched him forward from the sofa. There was a loud, cracking sound. He'd hit the edge of the coffee table before rolling off onto his back. "Shit," Riddick murmured as the world spun around him. He leaned forward, but coordination was an issue, and he didn't want to end up the same way as Henry, so he eased himself down to his knees between the sofa and the table. He took a deep breath. "Steady yourself, Paul." He exhaled and took another breath. The world was spinning, and he could so easily let himself fall back into that void, but he had to keep going. Henry was young, and I allowed this to happen. He reached out again. This time his hand fell on one of the lad's legs. Henry, who was lying on his back, didn't respond. Riddick tried shaking him, but wasn't sure if he'd put enough energy into it to register. "Damn it, you old dickhead, move yourself." Feeling close to vomiting now, Riddick worked his way between the sofa and the edge of the coffee table until he had more space. He couldn't measure the time it had taken to achieve this, but he eventually made it to Henry's side. "Oh, God." The gash in the centre of Henry's forehead looked severe. Blood ran over his pale face, mingling with the white froth that oozed from the sides of his mouth. He knew Tommy was there, watching. "He needs help, quickly." It surprised him he got the words out. "Please." Riddick slumped to his side now, beside the motionless man. He wanted to lift himself up, feel for Henry's pulse, maybe get a phone call off to the emergency services. But the floor seemed to suck him down, not allowing him to move. He glanced towards Tommy, standing above them now, looking down. "He needs help," Riddick managed. "He's past that," Tommy said. "Phone. Oh, help. You're out of your mind. You've forgotten what's in this house." Riddick couldn't find the energy to respond. A good thing. Right now his world may have been fragmented, but one thing was still clear. Demanding that Tommy invited emergency services to one of his main cribs was suicidal. Watching Henry lose his life was soul-destroying, but it had surely cost both their lives if he pressed this issue. Riddick closed his eyes, shutting out the swirl. Tommy said, "Seems I was right to be concerned about this batch. It's fried the both of you. Maybe cut it some more and let Taz and Sonia give it a whirl. But you've worried me, Jay, with your sentiment. You know what we've got coming this week?" Riddick tried to say, "Sorry, everything lost focus." But he wasn't sure if he got the words out. He hoped he had done. This was all he had left, and he needed it. He closed his eyes and fell back into nothing. Chapter 9. Blind Jacks attracted attention, mainly from drunken locals staggering home from other pubs. Despite being below his pay grade, D.I. Phil Rice took on the task of waving on the rubberneckers with relish. He always enjoyed the opportunity to demonstrate his power. The residents of Knaresborough knew Rice as a no-nonsense copper. He genuinely believed that being part of law enforcement meant you were on one side of a great war. Although Rice would never admit to it, he believed war needed a healthy dose of testosterone and a complete absence of modern-day bureaucracy and political correctness. As a result, Gardner had worked hard to keep him in check. She could chalk it up as a success to date. Frequently, he'd proven his hidden efficiencies. And to be fair, the way he waved on the rubberneckers with perfect ease was commendable. There was, of course, a notable exception. A group of off-the-rails local kids watching intently from the sides of the Christmas tree. Rice's evil eye had no impact on the new gen, of course. They knew a more rigorous system protected them than their predecessors, and didn't know what Rice's desired 1970s approach to policing looked like. As Rice wielded his axe, Gardner hopped from foot to keep warm, while forensics went about their business indoors. It was a small public house, after all. The fewer trampling around in there, the better. They'd already confirmed and recorded the identity of every person in the public house this evening, and after being warned that they may be contacted over the next couple of days, they'd long since made their journeys home. "Are you pissed, boss?" Rice asked, approaching Gardner. "I'm certainly pissed off that you just asked me that. Fair question. You were in the pub." She held up 3 fingers. 3 pints of ale, Phil. It was 4, but she preferred to keep ammunition from a cutthroat soldier like Rice. "Ale? Really?" He looked intrigued. She scowled. "You really are from the Dark Ages. You just didn't strike me as the ale type." "This is 2024. It's a fact that women can acquire the taste for hops too." He held up his hands.